We have some of the smartest guys in the business here in front of us, and we're going to have a panel discussion. It's going to be led by our host for today, the fellow, Michael Bravin. We've got some of the people that we've heard from before, David, Doko, and Philip Hodgetts. But newly joining us are Phil Holland. Phil's a cinematographer. He's on the end. And he's also a noted VFX producer. And we also have Liam Ford. Liam is the Senior VP of Engineering and Technical Operations at Light Iron. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael now.
Thank you. So, audience participation. Who knows what advanced resolution is? Who can guess what advanced resolution is? Pardon me? Beyond basic? Pardon me? HDR, okay. Anyone else? No takers? Okay. So all of those things are correct, but none of those are what we're going to talk about today. Actually, some of it is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about HDR. We're going to talk a little bit about resolutions above 1080, but rather than it being a technical conversation about number of pixels and lines per millimeter and nits, we're going to talk more about the creative aspects, the challenges for clients, and basically each one of the members of the panel's opinion about where we're going, where we are, where we're going, and what some of the challenges are. How's that sound? So what I'd like to do is we're going to go down the row of the panel, and we're going to have them tell you what their idea about what advanced resolution and HDR is, and then we're going to meld it all together, and then we'll give an opportunity for some Q&A. All right, so let's start with David. So David, from the aspect of being a pro rep and working with our displays, what's advanced resolution mean for you?
It means, for me, just right off the bat, it would mean 8K, because of course we're always trying to capture, Canon in particular is always interested, at least, in capturing, as much resolution as possible from our cameras. And we do have an 8K camera out there called the R5C, and that does have an 8K sensor, let's call it that. The HDR aspect of it, HDR, whether it's HD resolution or 2K or 4K or 8K, HDR does, it's like, HDR does give the impression of higher resolution, and that is because of the higher contrast that it can, now reproduce. So that is another combination of both HDR versus actual resolution, and that can simultaneously that can both be great in the audience experience, and also can present a lot of problems, as I can talk about later, as we, further in this conversation.
Great. And Philip, from the post-production perspective, tell us a little bit about what you see with advanced resolution and HDR.
I see a lot of storage problems. I see a lot of workflow problems, but also a lot of opportunities. I mean, not what Terry Curran says was like, yeah, you'll set up 2 cameras and you'll cut every angle out of the 8K because you're only finishing at 4K. No, I think there are 2 advantages. One, oversampled at the source is always going to look better further and further down the film, the chain that you go. A lesson I learned in trying to work out why 35mm on VHS looked better than my camera on VHS. And the source was, well, it was a better source in the starting place. And that's the big advantage of advanced camera formats.
Great. And Liam, from the post-production engineering technology standpoint, how do you see this?
Well, I think that the answer that we just got was kind of hinted on it. As things get bigger, it gets harder to move them around. It's not just storage, but it's also bandwidth, just networking bandwidth, moving stuff between facilities. It's the broadcast video technology, right? I mean, we're at 12G barely on a copper coax wire. Next step is SD2110, just transmitting larger and larger resolutions. It's it's pushing boundaries, and it's requiring more interesting, innovative compression formats, and it's going to be expensive too. I mean, right now, if everybody's talking about going to the cloud, if you're on AWS and you want to send something out of AWS, it costs you basically $90 a terabyte to do that, which is pretty expensive. And if something goes to 8K or 16K, I mean, you can do a terabyte like that, right? So it is just a lot of cost problems, I think. I think the technology to transmit all this stuff is there or almost there, but it's going to be really expensive for the foreseeable future to do it.
And before you answer the question, Phil, I wanted to make a brief statement about Moore's Law. Does everyone in the audience know what Moore's Law is? That as technology moves forward, the capacity to create more data doubles over what's the period of time?
Yeah,
You start
over a
going
period
down
of
this
time.
hole. I don't know where you're going.
And the reason I bring that up is because Phil is a worldwide known person to violate Moore's Law. He doesn't really care about how fast things are going to double or triple because he's already quadrupling and octagonally improving. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got on that journey?
To the point of the question with the advanced resolution, for me, from a filmmaker perspective as well as a post-production perspective, when it comes to image acquisition, it means one thing, and for display, it means another. So advanced resolution in display is different from, say, the camera technology, where obvious things like oversampling have benefits to, and you reduce it down to, say, 8K to 4K on delivery. But I think, notably for me personally, I've now finished out motion picture content in 32K last decade. But that's, all the bandwidth things. We're using boxes that are all gen locked and going out to emissive display panels that are all together. It's a real pain, and it's quite a process, and all the expense stuff. But interestingly, in the film industry, we've been scanning at very high resolutions, especially for large formats. I think traditionally, currently, most houses that do 70 millimeter IMAX 16-bit scans are 11 to 14K. And that's quite a heavy data set, but there is a market and a place for that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that need to advance in terms of broadcasting bandwidth, streaming as well, acquisition bandwidth. I like having cameras with various codecs ranging from RAW to a very svelte H.265 or something like that. Yeah.
So I was teasing a bit,
Okay.
but I think that you push the envelope for all of us here on the panel, and I think in our conversations, the creative drive to work at the highest possible resolutions and just a little bit above that is what drives you, and that's why the content that you create is so compelling. To kind of wrap a little bit about the comments that were made, it's to improve the experience and the storytelling for the audience. So using these tools, more pixels, more dynamic range, higher bandwidth, the purpose behind all of this is to improve the experience, the immersive experience of the content that's created. And so all of us on the panel and most of us in the audience, we spend a lot of time every day figuring out how to satisfy what clients are asking for to improve that experience, to improve the storytelling. And that's why we keep pushing the envelope of what the technology that's available. So I'm going to go back to you, Phil, to talk about how you use this additional resolution and additional dynamic range and additional color to improve the experience of the people that are in the audience.
The key word for me is immersion. I think some of the more profound moments I've had as I've been kind of on the bleeding edge of the technology when literally our industry was saying, we'll never do 4K. I mean, that was already yesteryear's news for me, so that wasn't even a conversation at that point. But one of the more profound moments I had was seeing, I've done work for all the TV manufacturers to do demo content for CES and commercial content. Some of my footage actually ships on TVs, which is pretty wild. And I remember one trade show, I was walking with a group of people who, this was a time where to show off HD and 4K, it was either time lapse or like golf. There was seemingly a lot of footage of golf for some reason. And they walked up to something I did for Sharp back in the day. And within like seconds, once they saw the footage running, they were completely captivated by it. And I was just spying on them. And I knew right then and there, they weren't going like, oh, I can see the blades of grass or anything. They were just fully looking at something from a decent distance too. They weren't right up at it. And, you know, I think it's always going to be a growing trend. Like, a lot of the world is HD right now. There's a lot of people still not finishing in HD. They're doing 720, which is spooky. I guess there's a 720 screen somewhere, right? But yeah, I mean, we now have hundreds of millions of 4K displays around the world. We have streaming services that have really put their foot forward on getting 4K quality content streamed at a fairly reasonable bandwidth. We have some new innovations with codecs coming very soon. I was just talking to Michael about stuff I've been doing with H.266 and A1, or AV1, probably known to most of the world at this point. And yeah, that'll shave a little bit of data off, so you might be getting some 4K on your phone a little bit easier. The possibility for 8K in the home is going to be right around the corner, really, if you have a semi-decent internet connection. You can do it on YouTube already. How many of you guys know that YouTube can support up to 16K streaming? Years ago. This is not actually new. But if you have VR, that's how they're tapping into that technology to properly display something that's a decent resolution and a good experience. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Liam, from the post-production facility standpoint, I'm assuming that the focus of the company is to satisfy what clients are asking for.
Right.
How do you overcome the technical burden that this puts on the facility? Or how do you address it?
Well, I can tell you that very few clients are asking for high resolution above 4K. It's not something we really see. I mean, even though cameras are capable of 8K capture and larger, the vast majority of people don't really care about anything above 4K in terms of the final output. You know, as we mentioned earlier, if they can shoot at a high res, it's great because we can down res from there, and you often get something better than if you just shot at the target res. But yeah, the vast majority of deliveries are still at 4K. Very few are at HD. I haven't seen one 720 deliverable in a long time, and a lot of that is studio-driven, distributor-driven. I'd say. But as we go forward, and as that will eventually happen, I mean, I remember when people were saying there's no reason to go past 2K either. It'll mostly just be, all you really have to do to take care of additional resolution is just buy more storage. A lot of times that's really the answer to the question. And thankfully, storage prices have come down drastically. NVMe is cheaper than ever. If anyone doesn't know, NVMe is flash-based storage, super fast. It's not spinning disk. And that's kind of what you would need if you wanted to do uncompressed 16K, for instance. You know, it's really difficult to do that on spinning disks. So that's all very hopeful. I think that the cost of storage coming down will match the pace of the desire for these higher resolutions in the marketplace, which again, it's not really hit us yet. Not at least on the delivery side of things. Capture side, sure, there's people playing with it, but everything that we get that's above 4K, we down-res to 4K for deliverables. And I don't know anybody else that's doing anything different just because the demand isn't there. HDR, however, that's a different story. HDR is completely resolution independent, but I would say that 2 years ago, 1 out of 20 jobs was HDR. Now 9 out of 10 are HDR.
And what's driving that?
A lot of times it's the studios. Netflix kind of leads the way on this. A lot of times they put a spec out there. They're a little bit ahead of the curve, and they're a little aspirational. And then what happens is everybody else starts following suit. They say, oh well, Netflix is requiring HDR deliverables, so you know HBO, Apple, Amazon Studios, they'll all be like, well, we got to require that too on our spec. It'll take them a little bit longer to get there, but they do. And then at least at first, the filmmakers, they find it frustrating. They just want to finish an SDR like they always have. Their beautiful Rec 709 output, you know, the theatrical output, the whole HDR thing. It was just a bother. But I would say in the last year, they have drunk the Kool-Aid. People are considering the HDR deliverable their hero more often than not now, where that was not the case even a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Philip, what about the tools, the post-production tools, the software, and the handling of these images?
I don't think a lot will actually change for the actual editor or the editorial team. These will be down-res to proxies of some kind, probably 4K proxies, by the facility, and the editor will be just working with the material that they've got. So I don't think a lot is going to change in the actual editorial phase, and particularly, every major NLE is already resolution independent. Give them enough memory and enough storage space, you can go up to these. You could, in theory, work with these already, but most people aren't going to go to that sort of extreme requirement of bandwidth. They're just going to work with proxies as they always have been.
Is there an advantage to working with original resolution proxies if you have the storage and you have the bandwidth to deal with it?
Honestly, not a huge amount, unless you want to do like direct from the video editor out to a screen for a screening. That would be the only time when it's advantageous to have the full resolution. But in the ordinary course of editorial, I don't think that's an issue.
And what about HDR proxies?
HDR is ubiquitous. I mean, I don't think anyone deliberately tries to produce stuff outside of HDR if they have the source.
David, what about from the monitoring and reference display side?
I think we're always being asked when I need a bigger display and I need an 8K. Actually, I've heard people asking me for 8K displays because they are interested, just like Phil. They want to see pixel for pixel on a reference display. That's what a reference display is. You don't necessarily want to deal with artifacting when you downsample or supersample. And and also just in the terms of the discussion, I just like to add, outside of the reference display, I think it's a lot of times it's just when we try to go for the higher resolutions like 8K, but then we of course hear of all these roadblocks and obstacles with storage and bandwidth and GPU and all that. I think that the question becomes: is it worth it? Because the user experience is it noticeable? Is for example the lenses? Canon makes great lenses, but even our very premium lenses are 4K edge to edge, and yet that's very hard to achieve, edge to edge 4K. So really 8K, and I'm sure Phil deals with trying to get that edge to edge, high resolution. But again, it's a lot of times when people are shooting 8K, like say with our R5C, they're using lenses that aren't even capable of 4K. So it becomes this whole kind of equation as to what do I have to put in to get that 8K or 16K. So is it worth it in the end? Because you may not, that one weak little part of that may result in a user experience that actually isn't taking advantage of that resolution. And so that's the point.
Yeah, Phil, I saw you're grinning and your head shaking, and I knew that was coming. Uniquely for the people on this panel, your background, because of your visual effects background and working with high resolution original images.
Yeah.
That's going to drive a different kind of a answer to this question, so go for it.
Yeah, to make a nod to that point, I used to work at a studio called Rhythm and Hues. I was there for 12 years. When I was hired in the 90s, I was hired by one of the 3 guys who designed the 4K film scanner back then. So I started in the 90s with 4K acquisition with film, back when storage was astronomically expensive. I remember when we had like 4 terabytes. Like that was a nightmarish quantity of storage.
That was on a card that fit in the camera.
No. We had like entire server rooms. I mean, it's crazy. And interestingly enough, predating Light Iron, I was a digital colorist before that job even existed. And it was back at this weird time where I still had to work with film labs because we were doing either some of the color work at the studio in matching the stuff that was processing purely optically, and then eventually it grew to slowly but surely it went to full feature films. Now the whole film goes through the process, and that 6-year span of time was rock and roll. I mean, every 3 months it felt like the world was changing around me, and I loved it. But to the points of a couple things there, the value of high-resolution acquisition, you can use a vintage lens. That doesn't necessarily resolve 8K. One of the powers of having a lot of resolution is removing that digital fingerprint. When you have too little resolution, it looks awful. We all know that. That's a fairly obvious thing. And to the point about working with native material or proxies at res, a lot of my projects, we actually maintain the raw footage through and through. But I've designed the pipeline for that. And there's a lot of interesting things you gain by doing that. If you actually have the hardware that can push that, it ups your efficiency a great deal. You don't have to do a lot of cross-referencing takes. When you have this editorial process going to color, okay, was this shot in ProRes or RAW? Was it transcoded? Where does the file set come from? You guys have to deal with that stuff constantly.
Yeah, I would say that we're doing a lot more that's just pure raw now. I would say that it's a rare job that gets transcoded super intermediate format.
Yep.
The hardware's there, cheap, resolve on a workstation, process a whole lot of raw, and so it's more and more becoming a direct raw based workflow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. And there's no one way to do it. And I think, interestingly enough, we had a couple of very talented assistant editors earlier today talking, and they were outlining the complications of having such a huge project in Premiere. A lot of editors I know, they're taking the material on a small drive and traveling around with the edit sometimes, even doing remote or cooperative work around the world. And that's a proxy workflow. You're not going to be carrying around a MacBook with a big old server size hard drive set up or whatever. So that's a great reason to transcode if that's the workflow you choose. At my office, we have a lot of online storage. The project I'm currently shooting is going to be landing around 300 terabytes. And that's also getting archived to 2 copies on site outside of being online at 300 terabytes. We have that backed up twice, basically. So yes, there are very real storage requirements, but again, things are cheaper than ever.
Yeah.
Do budget for storage. It's part of the production budget.
Yeah, again, I think that the storage cost is it's an obvious one, right? But I'm less worried about that because storage is cheaper and faster than ever before. The thing that hasn't really gone down that much in terms of price is bandwidth, is networking bandwidth particularly, right? And that's where we're really seeing, we're really kind of pushing up against the ceiling a little bit. It's expensive. It's not nearly fast enough. It's not getting faster at the kind of pace that you need. Internally, maybe, and I don't know, people have heard of like 10 gig, there's 25 gig, there's 100 gig, there's a new standard coming out, so internally we can start keeping up. But in terms of just like facility to facility, your house to my broadcast studio, that doesn't seem to be keeping up to pace as much, which is it's a little bit troubling, and that's where it's really expensive too. And actually, I think that's where I see a lot of the difficulty in the future with high resolution stuff is just kind of getting it to people over the network, because those lines, I mean, we're going to get 5G or we get Starlink, and that's great, but it's not really happening fast enough to keep up to pace with how much resolution the cameras can capture. And that's not even getting into like Sharp comes back with a 4-pixel, a 4 primary display again, and all of a sudden you get 4K, but instead of 3 primaries, you get 4 primaries, maybe there's 6 primaries, like there's so many ways in which you can double and quadruple the amount of data that you're going to be required to transmit. There's so many ways. Bit depth on most monitors, I think, is still 8-bit, even though it dithers to 10. But then let's say you have to transmit native 10 or native 12-bit or native 16-bit through the airwaves or through the internet pipes. It's just that's the thing that I think is going to get crazy. It's just how much we can actually push through the pipes.
I moderated a panel for the sports video group, and it was about 2 years ago, year and a half, 2 years ago. And the whole conversation from the broadcaster standpoint is the cost of the infrastructure to broadcast 4K material over the air was prohibitive. It meant a much more expensive retooling than when we went from standard definition to high definition. And so what they're pushing the TV manufacturers to do is to have the television do the up conversion. So they would send a 1080 HDR, maybe a 60p signal over the broadcast channel, and then the television would do the up conversion process. And most of the televisions that are out now do a pretty decent job of up conversion. So there's always an engineering solution that's looking to solve what's really a commercial issue. With Netflix, for example, Netflix wants everyone to watch 4K at home because they believe that's the image quality that you're entitled to, and that's their business model of being a 4K streamer, and the other streamers are following in their footsteps. How many people here in the audience currently have a 4K television? Yeah, that's what, 4 or 5. How many have an 8K television?
I think we need that outcome.
How many people that have 4K televisions have 4K streaming, like an Apple TV or? Okay, so I'd like to just ask a couple questions from the audience. So if you have a 4K television but you're not watching 4K content, is that just because that's the current television that you bought? Anyone have a comment about that?
YouTube TV is my primary streaming service.
Okay.
The best stuff that I see on television, and I go into Zen moments watching it, is his stuff on Apple TV screensaver. And I want to recreate everything he's done.
For those of you, just to fill all that in, for those of you that have Apple TV streaming boxes, is it just on the 4K box or all of the boxes?
Yes.
Okay. So for those of you that haven't bought a 4K Apple TV, you should go out and buy one today. But if you look at the screensavers, if you just let your TV sit there and you look at the screensaver, or you push the little TV button, you can see a lot of Phil's work, and you can see the images that they're showing that he's created show you what your system's capable of doing. And you don't have to pay anything extra for that. It's great test material.
Oh, we cycle them out through the year, so there's only so many that are live at any given point in time. But they do actually change throughout the year as well. So I could not actually tell you how many shots we've done that have made it, but it's considerable, and we're still doing it. So yeah. We are currently rolling on Red V Raptors. I was previously primarily helicopter, most of it. Sphere is about half the resolution of one of the projects I shot. And they're building that around an experience. It's obviously a sphere. So it's going to be something that you won't actually be doing very easily at home. And there's a lot more going on with sound and things like that. And I think that's cool. I think it's if you've ever been to a country that has a flyover, like in Iceland, they have that beautiful flyover display. The projection's awful. I hate the projection. I love the content. They need to update the screens. Yeah, a lot of people have done similar content to, provide some sort of, I don't want to say it's purely tourist attraction, because I see a lot of kids seeing that, much like the old edutainment IMAX stuff. So it's pretty cool. I would say any exhibition display that is putting that type of money in it, and I can't tell you the actual resolution. I've been involved with that project multiple times. Anyone who's doing exhibition at that level is going higher than 8K.
Yeah.
You're asking if we've hit through April. Through April, we've hit the ceiling. Before they answer, one of the things to keep in mind, what drives a lot of this is that there's companies that sell television sets, and the way they sell a television set is by having something that makes the television set that you own seem obsolete. And we're probably getting pretty close in terms of resolution to what television sets can do in terms of pixels, only because there's a physical barrier. I wouldn't say we're getting to the top of what a consumer television could do, but we're getting closer to what the technology allows for. But that's a huge business model that's driving selling television sets. On the other side of it, and it's a lot of what Phil's involved in, is for motion picture and visual effects, which are for movies. And I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, so some of the exciting times that I've been able to experience very firsthand, when digital projection came in, we had 2K and then 4K projectors pretty quickly. And I was working with THX to do a lot of testing on visual acuity and coming up with theories and testing groups. And this is actually translated into the timeline after that, where we've had blind resolution tests with Warner Brothers and all sorts of interesting things, like what is the thing? So I made a tool on my website. It's free to all of you. It's called Optimal Viewing. And that will help you calculate the distance from your display that you should be. And one of the more interesting things that I came up with, and I wrote a paper for the Academy about something called the window effect, which was my whole theory about removing that barrier. I was like, and it's tied to not just the screens. Back when TVs used to have really thick bezels, I noticed that distracted people. And when we started getting bezels that were thinner and thinner, people started feeling like they were looking more through a window. So it was kind of a window effect kind of came from that. The real question for me, based off of all of my research, I think there's a great deal of validity for 4K and 8K in the home. I am curious with a reasonably large size TV if there's ever going to be a reason beyond 8K in the home. For larger screen stuff, and I've been producing exhibition display work, very high resolution. You can go to Times Square and see a 40-foot display that I did in a 20 by 9. So it's really interesting seeing that content, but that's not something you have in your home. And we're not making movies for this crazy wide aspect ratio. It's like 8:1 or whatever it is. I think the question is really, what do you want? And yes, if you have a really small screen, there's a point where it's just crazy to have. You don't want an 8K phone. That's insane. Your pixel pitch would be like 800 pixels per inch or something like that, or more, even on a big phone. So,
But that brings up a use case for 8K to 8K displays right close to your eyes, which is the VR headset world. And I'm pretty sure that the new Apple VR headset's not going to be 8K displays, but I think it exceeds 4K. And the reason for that is we have a lens that's out in the showroom that you can see that fits on the R5 and the R5C, which is two 180-degree fisheye lenses in one housing. And when you look at them, and that camera's an 8K camera, so basically you're getting two 4K images when you capture with that lens. And even that material, that when you put it in a VR headset, is a little bit lacking in terms of the experience, the reality experience. So two 8K displays close to your eye, that's a perfectly good use case. Whereas having the same resolution 12 or 15 feet away in your living room isn't going to make a bit of difference.
yeah, exactly.
But when we're talking about creating material that's raw material for visual effects or for post-production, there's really, the limit is going to be what you can capture, not...
Yeah, I mean, it's been exciting for me because we're now into full frame and VistaVision size sensors. And at the time I came into the industry, we actually had a VistaVision film camera, and we were using that as a acquisition system to get a higher resolution negative for better composites and better anything we were doing with the visual effects. And that's where the validity really stands. I love the flexibility from a post perspective of having a higher resolution negative, digital negative or film negative, whatever you got. It just makes a difference.
And Philip, it's apparent that from an editorial standpoint, you're cutting pictures. You're not cutting resolution. It doesn't really seem that it makes much of a difference if you're just cutting for content, whether you have this high resolution or the HDR.
I don't think so. Even on most people's displays, they're actually not seeing much more than 1080. And certainly if you're working in an editorial window, you're seeing a very much reduced resolution that you're working with. I mean, we have to harken back to the early days of Media Composer. And people cut movies with like 16, some crazy little window that was in 4-bit. I mean, people couldn't even tell reliably if the shot was in focus. So, if we're using 720 or 4K, as a proxy, it doesn't really matter for the editorial flow. Certainly better than that little tiny window that we had in Media Composer 1 is required. But do we need to be working in the full 8K while we're cutting it? I don't think so. Maybe you want to argue with me.
No. I'm saying there's a space for all the workflows.
Yeah.
Right.
And one of the only real validity from, like, if you're doing a feature film, when you do have a higher resolution proxy, you can make QC decisions on the fly. Editorial can go, ooh, we got a buzz focus. Do we have a better take? There's all sorts of things that can come up. And if you're working with 720 or 1080p proxies, you may not see that stuff. And it may or may not matter. There's plenty of shots that, make the cut that shouldn't. Well, if the performance is there. One of the travesties that I've enjoyed watching quite considerably because the performance was good was there's a close-up on Anthony Hopkins in Westworld. And I've worked with him before, and I do think he's a very good actor. But when they missed the focus on him on a show like this, I got something happened to me. I got real mad. I was like, you got to do another. I don't care if you're running another 30 minutes late on your day. You got to get that shot. But whatever transpired.
That's because you're not the producer.
I know. Yeah.
We'll get your question. We'll get your questions in a minute. I just wanted to ask David to fill us in a little bit about the value of the larger, high-resolution reference display in a color and post-production environment. You know, why is it necessary to have things like focus and high-quality HDR?
Well, you just have to make sure that you're narrowing your focus. I think on set it's especially important too. Just like you don't want to, miss focus on Anthony Hopkins. And also for you, it's not really to do with resolution, but also on set that you just really need to understand, the visual acuity of what the camera is capturing in acquisition.
Yeah, part of the challenge is if you're dealing with 4K and 8K cameras, and you can't see focus in the monitor or in the eyepiece, it's a lot more difficult because you can't be off by as much without you being able to notice. You can't be off at all.
As some of you know, basically as your ability to capture resolution increases, the circles of confusion for depth of field becomes more acute, and so it's much harder to as that resolution increases to actually nail focus for that.
Yeah, it reminds me of an anecdotal story back in the early days of HD, 720 HD. A friend of mine was shooting for E Entertainment Television, and they got these new Panasonic 720p cameras, the very cams that came out, and they went out and shot a bunch of models on boats at Marina del Rey. And he called me in a panic at 11 o'clock at night. He said, I have to deliver this tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm going to do. Everything's out of focus. And I said, well, what's the delivery? And he said, the delivery's in standard definition. I said, don't worry about it. We'll make a dub. And this was Keith Ebo, by the way. You know Keith. We'll make a dub, and it'll look fine. And sure enough, when we dubbed it to standard definition, 525 lines, it looked tack sharp.
Wow.
So as we've gone to higher resolutions, it's much more important to make sure that the lenses can resolve, and you have the contrast, and you make sure that you're in focus.
So when you're shooting proper 15 perf IMAX film, you're using cameras that are cranky old cars. They wiggle a lot. Vibration starts impacting resolution at a tiny level or a minute level. The hyper frequencies and the subsonic stuff going on is wild, even with vacuum plates. So you sometimes are cutting the resolution in half, but what you are getting is a much cleaner image grain-wise. But when shot well with a lower ASA film like 50D, it's a very high resolving film. But if you take the 8K off of an R5C or any, like a Venice 2 or a Red Raptor, you might be able to out-resolve it. And I'll tell you another little part of that equation is the actual lenses being used. A lot of the lenses used for IMAX production are also dinosaurs. And they have a lot of character. They're beautiful in their own ways. But if you're there for the resolving power, you're not looking at using 40-year-old lenses. There's been too many optical revolutions. We were just talking about the 50 f1.2L for the RF mount, which I have no problem saying is the highest quality 50 millimeter prime on the market, cinema or still. I've tested it against everything, and it's phenomenal. And I've even gone through some extremely weird hoops to see if I can get it rehoused for cinema, because it kind of interests me. But that's weird stuff.
What you're typically getting at home is something that's just super compressed, and it's 4K. But yeah, it goes through just an amazing amount of compression, which is why I said earlier that I think that that compression has to get better and better. Like we just need better compression technology. Things like JPEG XS, I think, are a good step in that direction.
Good, though.
It does look good. I mean, compression technology now is way better than it used to be. But yeah, I think the bandwidth rate for a single 4K stream at home is something like 8 megabits. Is this 16 megabits only? 16 megabits. So 60 megabits a second is what you're getting at your house, right, when you're watching this 4K stream. If you were to play that back uncompressed, it's let's see, 1.2 gigabytes a second. You know, so like the difference between like the uncompressed, you know, rate and the compressed rate is just, it's astronomical. So yeah, and I don't know exactly what's being thrown away there, but yeah, it does look very good. There's very smart compression schemes out there, and yeah, it depends on, I don't know how it's going to look when I don't have an 8K TV. I don't know what that scheme is going to look like. Is it just going to double my bandwidth needs, or are they going to come out with something better? I guess we'll see. I don't know if anybody of you heard of Movie Labs before. Have you heard Movie? Okay, so Movie Labs is this consortium of studios that have gotten together a couple of years back, and they came up with this vision paper called the 2030 Vision Paper, or Movie Labs 2030, right? You've heard of this? Okay. So it lays out a bunch of very aspirational goals for post-production. One of them is the idea that you don't move files around anymore. Is that you shoot something, and that footage, it goes into a location, and then it never moves from that location. It doesn't get copied, it doesn't get sent around, it just stays there. And if you're a VFX house or an editorial house or whatever, you go to the bucket, or you go to the well and you pull from the well, but you don't make copies of it. You just kind of work off it, then you go home, and somebody else comes and works off it, and they go home, so the storage never moves. And I think that that's the answer to the question, and we're getting there. We're actually pretty close to being there in a lot of ways, where you don't have to move around big stuff. You just move it once to its location. It lives there for the rest of its life, and if somebody needs access to it, they go to it. With advanced applications that we're seeing now that can access storage remotely, that can stream. You know, we all work from home during a pandemic. A lot of that is because our remote desktop video streaming services right now are really good, and our compression is good. It can do high-speed video that looks good at low bandwidth, and so that's probably what's going to happen. We're just going to not move it anymore.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that Alan Lasky's not here today from Amazon, but the project that he's been working on is using the AWS, which is Amazon's web server system, and using a future camera-to-cloud system where all the on-set original material that's captured goes immediately in a low-latency, high-bandwidth way to the AWS, and then would be accessed by post-production facilities and editing facilities.
The workflow outline there is pretty much what I've been doing. There's a lot of interesting concessions with it, and I do have multiple workstations hard-lined in. So there's no real loss in terms of latency. One of the more interesting considerations we have to look at is the data rate that the camera material, the source acquisition material is, if it's raw or whatever. Usually you want to over-provision a fair bit. And right now what I'm doing is fairly large NVMe RAIDs, which are quite costly. But you can get pretty dangerous with some spinning disk technology, 8, 16 disk RAIDs and bigger. It just all depends on what you're actually trying to do. And that, I have to say, has been one of the things that has kept me a little bit more nimble than larger studios sometimes. And it does benefit in some ways. And like I said, there's never going to be one workflow. There's so much validity to pipelines, and sometimes pipelines per projects. Even the editorial techniques that we saw earlier today for everything, everywhere, all at once, they were doing stuff that was a little bit outside the norm from standard editorial. And that was because this project required a little bit of tooling, to make it work smoother. And I think that's something that's really awesome about our industry, because there's always a creative problem-solving situation going on, sometimes on a daily basis, which is awesome.
It's funny, because that was I remember that being a big complaint when we first started doing HD deliveries. And I kind of got into this business when HD was already kind of going a little bit, but people started complaining about it. All it meant is that a lot more beauty fix VFX guys got a lot more jobs. There's, all of a sudden there's a lot more work for those guys, and eye wrinkles, and, brown spots, and so we're cleaning that stuff up all day long. I actually think that the resolution is not that big of a deal for stuff like that. My pet peeve is the high frame rate stuff. For me, that's the thing that removes the kind of the magic from the situation more than anything else. And and really reveals. I don't know if anybody here saw the new 3D high frame rate Hobbit. I don't know if you saw that at all. But when I saw that, and maybe this was just me, but when I saw that, to me, like the rocks when they were falling, they looked like styrofoam rocks at that, frame rate, at that so I'm a big fan of 24. But that I think is the thing that now is more of a potential problem than resolution, because resolution we could just in a flame bay make people prettier all day long. That's okay,
Yeah, just to add something to that whole discussion is that with HDR, it's the same problem, is that badly color graded HDR can really reveal a lot of bad tonal problems in the face. It can accentuate it horribly because you're dealing with like higher contrast oftentimes in the midtones. And so the colorist has to be very good at that and careful. And back to Phil's point, there is a lot to be said for acquiring, at 8K or higher resolutions, but using soft lenses or vintage lenses, you're still super sampling and getting better color, and there's a lot of benefit to that. I think there's ways that we can manage, to have higher resolution, but not necessarily to make it look awful.
Yeah, I'll make a couple interesting points about the HFR, high frame rate display content. High frame rates are great for slow motion. That's awesome. I was doing some interesting work before a filmmaker passed, a pretty legendary dude, because he was a big 60p guy, and then he got a real craze about 120. And some of our conversations, especially about 3 years before he passed, I was outlining some of the problems that high frame rate production has. When you are shooting more frames per second, and you've probably noticed this in The Hobbit and various other things, anything you do wrong is highly visible. 24p has got this little magic blur thing that just kind of hides a little. You kick the tripod, you may not even notice it. But you're shooting 60p and showing it 60p or more, anything you do with the camera movement starts becoming very evident. So I've even talked to Peter Jackson years ago about this. Like, I strongly felt that the shots needed to be designed in a more concerted way to keep people not distracted by the high frame rate. And you'll notice a lot of the higher frame rate content in Japan. We don't really get that stuff here, but NHK's got a bunch of stuff, and it's pretty cool. But they do a lot of locked off or extremely controlled moves. And it's, I don't know if I'd want to see Rambo shot that way, but it's interesting. And I think there's still a story to be written there, but I'm pretty much with Liam on the 24p, maybe 30. I kind of like 30 for some of the motion cadence stuff too, even at higher resolutions where, and HDR, actually, this is interesting. HDR has made us change our pan speeds, because strobing and judder, the pan judder that can happen, the higher the contrast, the more evident that can be. So I had to make a tool to even figure that out, because we started mastering for 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, so on. And you have to kind of be aware of that stuff now, whereas we kind of almost anyone who's been shooting SDR film for so long, especially if you had a lower contrast style, you know what you can get away with. You feel it in your veins. But HDR is the Wild West still, and a lot of people are still learning how to do it very well.
All right, great. Well, thanks, gentlemen, and thanks for the audience for sticking with us. Just kind of as a wrap-up, one of my, I think, missions, or one of my guiding principles, and I think I've shared, we all share this, is that we're involved in the technology, but the purpose of our involvement in the technology is to support the creative community, to make sure that they can do what they do, which is to tell the stories in a way that really has an effect on us. But it's important to have these conversations and see how far we can push the technology. But at the end of the day, the creative people have to adopt it and use it in an effective way for us, without it being distracting, or without it being too much bandwidth to go through the internet, or being able to receive it at home. So I say let's keep pushing the envelope as far as we can, but let's also keep an eye on what our audience is really looking at, and what our creative community is looking at. And again, thank you. Well, I'll let Jim do a wrap-up, but I want to thank you for taking the time out this afternoon, and this has been a great experience for all of us.